more often than not, at these midterm elections, as you've said, the stock market actually does rather well coming out of it. Could that be because, in a way, the stock market likes the gridlock? They don't necessarily want um, whoever's in charge just to have a free 4-year presidential term of a lapdog Congress. They almost prefer when Congress flips and makes things a bit more difficult. So the government maybe finds it more difficult to meddle in the markets in various ways. Hello and welcome. I'm John Butler, co-host along with James Early of Across the Pond, a show where we discuss important issues of the day on both sides of the Atlantic and the potential importance and relevance they will have for investors also on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm based in London, James Early is based in Washington, and in this edition of Across the Pond, we'd like to tackle what to many is probably the single most important political development occurring this week, the US midterm elections. So what do we think is going to happen? And what importance could that have for investors not only in the United States, but also across the pond in UK, Europe, and for that matter, perhaps around the world? So to begin, I think, and James is clear on this point, we need a little bit of background. And the reason why is because the way the US federal government works is fundamentally different than the way many other governments works, and that certainly includes the parliament here in the UK. So giving us a little bit of the background about what's playing out in the US at this moment in time and what it means within the context of the US's unique political system, James is going to offer us some of that helpful background.
Thanks, John, for that intro. And this is a special edition of Across the Pond, not just because we're talking about a political topic, but because I have COVID as well. Hopefully the first and only COVID edition, but I have motivation and I have cough drops, so we'll see what we can do. If you're not familiar with the U.S. system, I mean, roughly speaking, we've got the White House, which is the presidency. We've got the court system, the judiciary, and we've got Congress, which is the House and the Senate. So the House has 435 people. This is done by population per state. Those guys get or ladies get reelected every 2 years. The Senate has 100 people, 2 per state. This is the idea that no matter how many people you have some like separate designated representation just as a state. And the Senate people serve 6-year terms. We have 34 coming up for reelection now. And so right now, both of these houses, both parts of Congress, I should say, are controlled by Democrats, and we have a Democratic president. So it's as good as it gets as far as putting through kind of pro-democratic legislation. Very, very unlikely that this continues. Now, if it does continue after this election, if somehow the Democrats stay in power, then watch out, big pharma, watch out, big oil. Okay, probably see more aid to Ukraine, things like that. Abortion, right? Rights may shift a little bit. We've seen a lot of. I mean, in general, though, the people are when there's a Republican or when there's a Democratic president, I should say, Congress doesn't tend to go Democratic in the subsequent midterm election like we're seeing, and vice versa. Another point I'll mention, and then we can kind of cut to the mustard here, is that in general, midterm elections are good for the stock market after they happen. U.S. Bank looked from 1962 until now at all the midterm elections, and they found that if you start at November 1st of that midterm election year and look forward 6 months, the stock market on average went up, I think it was 15 to 16%. I'm forgetting the exact number. Whereas in non-midterm election years, it was just like 4% something. So a big difference. The market tends to not be so good up until that November. Then it tends to go better. But I will say this. I would not recommend like playing the election as a major thesis point. I mean, you can keep it in mind. It can be a consideration, but if the outcome of the elections are very hard to predict, and even if the election itself happens, there's not a guarantee that all those things you expect are going to actually get passed. So there's a lot of contingencies, some of them dependent on the whims of a few people. And so if like the result of an election is like the core part of your investment thesis, I would recommend making it a little bit more robust. But that said, we have an election. Here we are. It tends to be good for the market. And so let's talk about it.
Well, absolutely. And this is where it gets interesting in a way, because as you're saying, it's really hard to derive practical, actionable investment ideas out of what you think a given US midterm election result would be. Because let's face it, the US has a separation of powers. And even if the Congress and the president are the same power, that doesn't necessarily mean it's still super easy to get things done. It might be easier to get things done. And if whoever's president and whoever controls Congress are of different parties, well, then perhaps you have a recipe for gridlock. But isn't that interesting that more often than not, at these midterm elections, as you've said, the stock market actually does rather well coming out of it? Could that be because, in a way, the stock market likes the gridlock? They don't necessarily want um, whoever's in charge just to have a free 4-year presidential term of a lapdog Congress. They almost prefer when Congress flips and makes things a bit more difficult. So the government maybe finds it more difficult to meddle in the markets in various ways.
I think this is a very salient observation, John. I think the market is sometimes smarter than we give it credit for, and I think you're right. I think the market also likes certainty. I mean, once the election happens, then you know what's going to happen, or at least you think you know. And so that's true too. And in this case, I'm going to guess just to cutting to the chase here. I think the most likely outcome is more gridlock. I mean, it's very unlikely that I mean Biden's popularity is not that high, let's be honest. So in 2024 there is a pretty good chance, and plus he's getting up there in age. There is a pretty good chance we're going to see a Republican president. Step one. um, I think it's very least likely outcome is Democrats retain control of Congress. I think second least likely outcome is Republicans win both houses of Congress. Most likely outcome is probably um, you know House goes Republican and maybe Senate stays Democrat. But I mean, this is a borderline thing. I mean, it's going to come down to battleground states. It's not clear in 2016. The world got a wake up call. I mean, the people were 98, 99% sure. Some of the best statisticians that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency, and lo and behold, she did not. So, I think we've learned do not be too confident in predicting elections, but most likely, we'll have a divided Congress. And what does that mean? Well, I think it means status quo. I mean, status quo right now is not a divided Congress, but I think it means like the stuff we're seeing now is not going to change very much. Democrats obviously are not going to have their way to, I say levy any windfall taxes on big oil, for example, which Biden is talking about now. Um, Generally speaking, Republicans want to reduce spending, especially now, and Democrats are a little bit more willing to spend. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, which ironically did a lot of things, inflation was just kind of a minor part of that. It was reducing it increased taxes on corporate America by roughly $300 billion in exchange for knocking off $300 billion of the budget. Um, I think that's likely to stay. Republicans don't like that. They think they want to um, not have those higher taxes, those higher corporate taxes. But if we get a divided Congress, I think that's going to stay. That also allows pharmaceutical companies pretty soon to start negotiating drug prices, or Medicare to start negotiating with pharmaceutical companies, which the pharma companies do not like. They're afraid of this, but like it's reality, as long as the status quo remains. So I think relatively, pardon me, I think relatively little change there. Um, and so both sides are going to be a little frustrated, but as people say often, a good deal is one where both people feel like they didn't quite get what they want. And maybe that's the best outcome from the U.S. Now I'm kind of a centrist, so that's my bias. Um, I get scared when I see the rhetoric on the extremes of both sides, so I'm okay with that. And I'm guessing the market is going to be okay with that too.
Well, I mean that they probably will, and again, it's very frequently the case that the market does just fine when you have a divided Congress, when you have president and Congress controlled by different parties. As I recall, that was the case throughout most of Clinton's 2 terms, and yet the stock market did phenomenally well for the most part during that time. So there are lots of examples of that. But the separation of powers in the US is not only at the level of the federal government. You also have, of course, the states retaining a certain amount of power with their own budgets and whatnot. There are a lot of state elections that will be taking place. Who knows what's going to be happening there? And then, of course, there's perhaps the biggest economic division of power of all, which is that between the US federal government, which controls the US federal budget, and the Federal Reserve, which of course controls monetary policy in ways which some would argue even begin to border on having fiscal policy implications. Tell us a little about that dynamic and what might be at play there.
Yeah, it's a great point. And by the way, on the states, 36 states, John, are going to have governor elections. The governor is the leader of the state. So we have 50 states total. So that's most of them. So that's a big thing too. Governors, though, I think governors have less power than people may think. Like if you're just looking at the U.S., but they do have certain powers. Yeah, it's a good. So if you look at articles about what voters are caring about, the economy is basically the economy. Whether it's inflation, whether it's the stock market, whether it's recession. They may express it in different terms, but the economy is far and away the number one issue. Um, Question is though, like, what can these elected leaders actually like do about the economy? How much is in their power versus how much is in the hands of the Federal Reserve? My argument is that at least for inflation, uh, the the political side has less power. Things like Social Security, Medicare. These are sort of government entitlement expenses. Those are effectively sacred cows. They've got strong voter contingents. AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. That's the most powerful lobby in the U.S. They are not going to be happy for any big cut. So I think it's political suicide for anyone, Republican or Democrat, to go in and try to massively chop down spending. And
It would be like going after the NHS here in the UK, right?
exactly, it's a great parallel. Yeah, and with with Russia invading Ukraine recently, with China possibly scheming at some point to attack Taiwan. China, recently militarizing islands in the Pacific. I don't think massive cuts to defense are going to be on anyone's agenda as well. So I think as much as the Republicans talk about reducing spending, I think the reality is going to be a lot harder. So in other words, I'm betting that the political side is mostly going to be status quo. I think inflation is going to be largely managed by the Fed, by interest rates. And I'm an optimist. And I realize that puts me almost in a minority camp in some way, but I think inflation is starting to come down. It is. I think it's in 2 or 3 years, I think it's going to be a lot better. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we got so much money. We do have a lot more money printed, but it hasn't been zipping around as fast as it could. In the beginning, it went into asset prices, right? We had inflated asset prices, and now it's going into goods and services prices. But I think the high interest rates eventually are going to take their toll. So that's a Fed thing. That's not a political thing. In terms of fiscal policy, I think we'll see more if we have a different president in the White House in a couple of years. But until then, I'm not expecting any great shakes. I think it's a Fed move.
Well, in fact, it looks like, the way you're talking, that in fact you could start seeing things swinging wildly back the other way. You've seen some very aggressive Fed rate hikes, very large increases in mortgage rates, signs of stress in the housing market. Now, if the Republicans do get partial or total control of Congress and want to deny Biden any further victories on spending anywhere, well, then you could also get some fiscal drag, adding up with what may already be a lot of monetary drag just beginning to enter the system. Maybe you see a sudden big downturn in activity. Maybe that brings inflation right on down. Maybe that weakens the dollar. Because, of course, we know
Yeah,
how
yeah.
strong the dollar currently is in a historical comparison.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And I think, yeah, I think the dollar. It's too strong in my view now, and unfortunately, it's looking like it's going to keep going. But I think a lot of people would welcome a weaker dollar worldwide. That's going to set into motion I mean, I think the dollar is, I mean, no question, the dollar is coming under attack globally. And the stronger it gets, the more the dollar has a target on its back, right? And we've seen the dollar go up and up and up, and you got these naysayers saying, oh, this is, look how irresponsible the U.S. is being. The dollar is going to crash. Well, they said the same thing after the great financial crisis. And what happened? The dollar just kept going up and up and up, right? Because I overuse this analogy, but we may be a drunk driver, but we're the least drunk driver on the road, right? And so, I think we've got the same thing here. And I think, eventually you get, too much of a good thing. And China, and you got a lot of the other places. I mean, China's got a long road to hoe before they can oust the dollar in any meaningful way, no matter how hard they try. I mean, I think they just don't have a realistic chance for a lot of reasons. I don't, yeah, I don't see the dollar's strength coming on forever. And I think the more Republican we get, the more likely that gets to.
Do you think it looks at all like 1987? If you recall, in 1987, the dollar was extremely strong, and the Louvre Accords that were agreed between all the major economies to weaken the dollar got going that summer. But by the fall, as a result of a significantly weaker dollar, there was some concern that the dollar was getting too weak. Basically, and you ended up with the October 1987 stock market crash occurring in part because markets were concerned the Fed was going to overdo it. Again, is there a chance the Fed is actually going to end up overdoing it this time around if the dollar begins to weaken materially? Anyway, I'm just throwing it out there, but there are a lot of extremes in markets right now, it seems to me, and the dollar is arguably, one of the most extreme of all.
That's a great point, John. And I think we're lucky. Any viewers, at least as a participant, I'm lucky too. You are the most informed economic historian that I'm aware of. So I always enjoy talking with you about this. I mean, the world has conspired many times to try to weaken the dollar. It's not the first time. And the Fed also has gone to extremes recently. I mean, obviously, they massively missed inflation along with basically every other central bank to their credit. I mean, they got it. They just got a whole lot more of it than they expected. Um, yeah, I mean, look, nothing is off the table. The weird recursiveness of the situation, though, is that if that were to happen, like I kind of see that as happening in the context of a general world malaise as well. If the U.S. gets sick, the world catches a cold, and the recursiveness is you might see more piling into the dollar for safety
Maybe.
in that circumstance.
Maybe indeed that's possible, and I think it's very dangerous to look at any of these developments, political, economic, monetary, and approach it with any kind of monocausal reasoning. That is to think there's one factor, which is the only factor that matters at a given point in time. Things are far too fluid for that. I would just point out that all of these events that we're referring to, political, economic, monetary, they are occurring in a context of asset markets, both stocks and bonds, which, notwithstanding material corrections in value this year, still, in a historical comparison, still look pretty expensive to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, price to sales. I was looking at a chart in the US stock market has come down, but pardon me, it has come down only to about the peak it was in the tech bubble. Okay. In late 1990s, 2000s. So that's not that great. I mean, we by historical standards, the markets could still have a long way to fall. There was a lot of well-meaning, love and energy and resource pumped into the system by central banks across the world for 10, 12, 13 years. And that's starting to have effects. I mean, we're basically living in a great big economic experiment, and we kind of always will be, right? Because economics is a social science. It's determined not by external laws, but by what people believe and the beliefs that people act on. And there are often time delays and lags, and it's very hard, as you mentioned, to isolate things to a single stimulus and response feedback loop. It's much more complex than that, but that ambiguity is also what gives rise to profit making potential. In other words, if everything were a hard and fast science, then you couldn't really make money because someone else would have done it already, right? But if you can kind of read the ambiguous tea leaves better than the next guy, then you can make money.
But
Let me
it
ask you a
seems to me
question.
that kind of it seems to me that kind of brings us back neatly and nicely to where we started. That is, notwithstanding all the headlines around the U.S. Elections as something that could potentially be important, really the broader context remains more or less as it was, and it's not clear that that's going to be changed fundamentally, or if at all, by the outcome that we see in the elections this week. It seems to me we're simply still in an environment, and feel free to disagree. We're still in an environment where investors should, from a macro point of view, be defensive, but by all means, always be looking for those pockets of opportunity when and where they might arise.
I think you're exactly right, and to that I credit a small group of men who, rebelled against England, much as I lived, years ago, and set up a system with strong checks and balances. So the fact that we can have an election changed like this, and there's not going to be, it's not like in China, or it's not like in some authoritarian place where everything goes the other way, right? Where things are largely going to be status quo, despite all the hype, despite all the media buzz. Um, I think that's a positive. It's relatively hard to move the needle, and it should be.
I think that's a good summary and a good place for us to stop. We are at our time target anyway for this episode. So thank you, James, very much for your input. Most helpful for those on both sides of the pond, I would say. And let's keep our eyes open for the inevitable, invariable next set of exciting topics as they roll in over the next couple of weeks, and have another chit chat when they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, guys, for all your comments under the videos. We got a lot of great comments, and we appreciate them very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone, and until next time.